On April 28, 1945, in a small Italian village, one of history's most powerful dictators faced the final moments of his life. Mussolini had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades. He had commanded armies, shaped nations, and bent the will of millions to his authority. Yet in his last hours, he was no longer Il Duce. The leader, he was simply a man facing death. What happened in those final hours? What did he say? Who was with him? And what do his last words reveal about a man at the end of his reign? Stay with us as we uncover the dramatic final chapter of Benito Mussolini's life and the woman who died beside him. To understand the circumstances surrounding Mussolini's final moments, we must first understand how Italy's dictator reached that point, how a man who had seemed invincible for so long found himself hunted and desperate in the closing days of World War II. Benito Mussolini had come to power in 1922 through a combination of political cunning, nationalist fervor, and organized violence. The fascist movement he led promised to restore Italian greatness, to establish a new Roman Empire, to make Italy a superpower. For years, it seemed to work. Italy conquered Ethiopia. Italy intervened in Spain's civil war. Italy aligned with Nazi Germany in what Mussolini called the Axis. But by the mid-1940s, the reality had become undeniable. Italy was losing. The Germans, who were supposed to be the dominant partner in the Axis, were themselves being pushed back on all fronts. In North Africa, Italian and German forces had been defeated in Italy itself. American and British forces had invaded and were steadily advancing north. The Italian home front was devastated by bombing campaigns. The population was exhausted and hungry. In July 1943, Mussolini's own government turned against him. The fascist Grand Council voted to remove him from power. King Victor Emmanuel III, who had tolerated Mussolini's rule for more than 2 decades, finally acted. Mussolini was arrested and imprisoned. But the drama was not over. Nazi Germany, still fighting desperately against the Allies, orchestrated Mussolini's rescue. German special forces liberated him from his prison in the Italian mountains. Mussolini was transported to northern Italy, where he was installed as the puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic, a Nazi-controlled territory that represented what remained of Italian fascism. For nearly 2 years, Mussolini operated as a figurehead in this puppet state, presiding over territory that grew smaller by the month as Allied forces advanced. His power was illusory. Real authority rested with the German military commanders. Mussolini was essentially a prisoner with the ceremonial trappings of leadership. By the spring of 1945, the situation had become catastrophic. Nazi Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. In Italy, the Allied forces were pushing steadily north. The Italian Social Republic controlled only a shrinking territory in the far north of Italy. Mussolini understood that the end was near. The Nazi regime he depended on for survival was disintegrating. German commanders were losing interest in maintaining the facade of Italian leadership. Mussolini was increasingly a liability rather than an asset. The German military was preoccupied with survival, not with propping up a puppet regime. In late April 1945, as the Allies approached from the south and Soviet forces encircled Germany from the east, Mussolini made a desperate attempt to escape. He had spent the last weeks in Milan, watching his power evaporate. As Italian partisans and resistance fighters began to move openly in the territory, as German forces retreated in disorder, Mussolini made the decision to flee. On April 25, 1945, Mussolini left Milan in an attempt to reach the relative safety of the German Alpine territories to the north. With him was a small entourage of advisors, supporters, and family members. This group represented what was left of the fascist regime. Not an army, not a government, but a collection of desperate individuals fleeing toward an uncertain fate. Traveling with him was Clara Petacci. She was a woman in her early 30s, substantially younger than Mussolini, who was now 61 years old. Petacci had been Mussolini's mistress for years. Their relationship had begun before the war and had continued through the years of conflict. Petacci had chosen to remain with Mussolini as his regime crumbled, remaining loyal even as others abandoned him. The small group traveled north, attempting to reach Switzerland or Germany, hoping to find safety or at least to delay capture. But their journey was interrupted. On April 27th, the group was intercepted by partisans, members of the Italian resistance who had been fighting against fascism throughout the war. Mussolini and his companions were captured. Petacci was captured alongside him. There was no longer any possibility of escape. Mussolini was now in the hands of his enemies, the very resistance forces that had fought against fascism and that had lost comrades to fascist violence. What happened in the hours following capture would become one of the most dramatic and debated moments in the final chapter of World War II. After their capture, Mussolini, Petacci, and other members of their group were held overnight by the partisans. The exact details of these final hours are uncertain. Partisan accounts differ, and many of those involved died in subsequent years without providing detailed testimony. However, what is known provides insight into the psychological and emotional state of the captured dictator. Mussolini was reportedly shocked by his capture. For years, he had imagined that he might escape, that somehow his political cunning or German protection might preserve him. The sudden reality of his complete powerlessness was disorienting. He was no longer Il Duce. He had no authority, no command, no ability to order others or escape consequences. During the night, Mussolini was kept under guard. Some accounts describe him as being surprisingly calm, even philosophical about his situation. Other accounts suggest he was agitated and fearful. The contradictions in these accounts reflect both the unreliability of memory and the dramatic and traumatic nature of the events for those involved. What is clear is that during this night, Mussolini became aware that he would likely be executed. He was not a prisoner of war in the traditional sense, to be held and eventually tried. He was a captured enemy of the resistance, a man they blamed for decades of oppression, violence, and the suffering of World War II. Execution was a probable, perhaps inevitable outcome. Clara Petacci remained with Mussolini during much of this time. The nature of their relationship during these final hours is not entirely clear from historical records. What is documented is that she remained loyal to him, staying with him even in his final night of captivity, despite the danger this loyalty represented to her own safety. The partisans made the decision to execute Mussolini the following morning. This decision was made not through any formal legal process, but as an act of revolutionary justice. The resistance movement in Italy had fought against fascism for years. Mussolini represented the fascist regime that had oppressed them. In their view, execution was an appropriate response to his crimes and his continued attempts to escape accountability. On the morning of April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were transported from their overnight location to a small village called Giulino di Mezzegra, near Lake Como in northern Italy. They were transported by truck along with some other members of their captured group. The village itself was not significant in historical terms. It was an ordinary Italian community that happened to be in the path of events that would make it a place of historical importance. The partisans chose this location for the execution, selecting a courtyard where the deed could be carried out. As Mussolini approached the location of his execution, he was confronted with the reality of his imminent death. Unlike dictators who had access to palaces and grandeur, Mussolini faced his final hours in an ordinary place, a village courtyard, not a grand edifice or ceremonial space. There are accounts from partisans and others present that describe Mussolini's demeanor in these final moments. Some describe him as maintaining a degree of composure. Others describe him as showing fear or resignation. The accounts vary, and it is difficult to establish with complete certainty the exact nature of his emotional state. What is documented is that Mussolini asked to face his executioners. He requested that he be allowed to die standing, rather than sitting or kneeling. This request may have reflected pride, a final attempt to maintain dignity in the face of death, or it may have reflected a desire to meet his fate with some semblance of the authority and confidence he had once possessed. Clara Petacci was present at the execution site. She had not been required to witness Mussolini's death. She could have been separated from him, kept away from the events about to transpire, but Petacci had apparently chosen to be present, to remain with Mussolini in his final moments. In the courtyard, as the firing squad prepared to carry out the execution, Mussolini spoke. His final words were few. According to accounts from those present, as the soldiers raised their weapons, Mussolini expressed concern not for himself, but for Clara Petacci. He reportedly asked that she be spared, that her life be saved despite her association with him. It is a moment that reveals something about Mussolini, even as he faced death. Not a moment of regret or remorse for his regime's actions, but a moment of personal concern for a woman he cared about. Whether this moment should be understood as revealing genuine human feeling, or as a final attempt at manipulation, is subject to interpretation. What is clear is that it occurred. The execution itself was chaotic and brutal. Firing squads in such circumstances are rarely trained professionals conducting orderly executions. Instead, they are often armed partisans, some of them with personal reasons for wanting their target dead, some of them emotionally turbulent from years of conflict. The first volley of shots was fired. Mussolini was struck multiple times. He fell, but the execution did not end there. In addition to the gunfire, Petacci was also shot. She died beside Mussolini in the courtyard, her loyalty to him extending to her final moments and her final fate. What followed the initial execution was an act of humiliation and desecration that reflected the depth of hatred and rage the partisans felt. The bodies of Mussolini and Petacci were removed from the courtyard. They were transported to Milan, to the central square called Piazzale Loreto. In Milan, the bodies were hung from meat hooks in the Piazzale, suspended in a public square where crowds could view them. The corpses were subject to abuse from the gathered crowds. Some accounts describe physical violence inflicted on the bodies after death. The treatment reflected the depth of the population's anger and the desire to ensure that Mussolini received no dignity even in death. This public desecration was unprecedented in Italy's recent history. Mussolini had ruled for more than 2 decades. He had styled himself as Il Duce, the great leader, a man of destiny. He had imagined monuments and legacy and historical importance. Instead, his final image was that of a corpse suspended in a public square, subject to the rage of crowds. For Clara Petacci, the end was equally undignified. She had been a private person, not a public figure in the way Mussolini was. Yet her loyalty to Mussolini had resulted in her being captured alongside him, executed alongside him, and subjected to the same public desecration after death. In the years following the execution, various people who were present in the courtyard or involved in the events provided accounts and testimonies about Mussolini's final words and final moments. These accounts have become part of the historical record, though they vary in detail and sometimes contradict each other. One of the most detailed accounts comes from partisans who were present at the execution. They described Mussolini as attempting to maintain some dignity in his final moments, asking to face the firing squad standing rather than sitting. They described his concern for Clara Petacci, his request that she be spared execution even though she was captured alongside him. Some accounts describe Mussolini as speaking words of defiance, even in his final moments. Other accounts suggest he was more resigned, accepting of his fate. The variations in these accounts reflect the chaos of the moment and the different perspectives of those witnessing it. What is clear is that Mussolini did not make a long speech or deliver profound final words that would be preserved verbatim for history. His final moments were not theatrical or dramatic in the way Hollywood might depict them. They were sudden, violent, and quickly concluded. The execution took minutes. The desecration and public display took longer and became more memorable than the execution itself. The testimony of those present also describes the execution as reflecting genuine partisan emotion rather than calculated military procedure. This was an act of revolutionary justice, not a formal military execution. The partisans who carried it out were not soldiers following orders, but resistance fighters who had fought fascism for years and who had lost comrades to fascist violence. Clara Petacci's final moments received less recorded attention than Mussolini's, reflecting the historical tendency to focus on the prominent figure rather than those close to them. But what is documented is that she remained with Mussolini throughout his captivity and execution. Her loyalty to him, even in the face of death, is documented in multiple accounts. The execution of Mussolini and Clara Petacci must be understood within the context of the Italian resistance movement and the final chaotic days of World War II in Europe. By late April 1945, the war was effectively over, though fighting continued in scattered locations. Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces were advancing from the East American and British forces controlled most of continental Europe. In Italy, the Allied forces had secured most of the country, and were pushing toward the north. But in the final weeks and days of the war, the situation was chaotic. Nazi Germany was fragmenting. Italian partisans were emerging from hiding and taking active control of territory. Fascist institutions that had seemed permanent and immovable only months before were dissolving. Fascist officials and military officers were being captured and, in some cases, summarily executed by resistance forces. Mussolini's execution was one event among many in this broader pattern of resistance, justice, and revolutionary action. Throughout Italy, fascist officials were being captured and executed by partisans. In Germany, Nazi leaders were being hunted and captured. In the chaos of war's end, formal legal procedures seemed almost quaint. Revolutionary justice was being administered by those who had fought against fascism. The execution of Mussolini was not unique in this regard. What made it historically significant was not the execution itself, but who was being executed. The man who had ruled Italy and shaped European history for more than 2 decades was now being subjected to summary justice by partisans in a village courtyard. The partisans who carried out the execution had no doubt about the justice of their action. Mussolini had represented oppression. Fascism had represented violence and totalitarianism. In their view, Mussolini's execution was not murder, but accountability, a settling of accounts for decades of fascist rule. To understand the significance of Mussolini's final moments, it is important to consider what his regime had represented and how it had ended. Mussolini had come to power in the aftermath of World War I, at a time when Italy was economically unstable and politically fragmented. He had promised order, national greatness, and the restoration of Italian power. The fascist movement had appealed to many Italians who were frightened by socialist revolution and attracted by nationalist promises. For years, Mussolini's regime seemed to deliver on some of its promises. Italy experienced economic growth, though much of it was artificially driven by military production. Mussolini carried out public works projects that were visible and impressive. He established order, though the order was maintained through violence and suppression of opposition. But Mussolini's fundamental failure was military. He had allied Italy with Nazi Germany in hopes of sharing in German victories and European conquest. Instead, Italy found itself pulled into a world war it could not win. Italian military performance was often poor. German military forces had to rescue and support Italian armies. By 1943, it was clear that the Axis was losing the war. The collapse of the Mussolini regime had been rapid. Within months of Mussolini's fall in July 1943, Italian territories were being lost to Allied forces. The German-controlled puppet regime that replaced Mussolini's direct rule was weak and dependent entirely on German military support. By April 1945, that regime had lasted less than 2 years and was itself collapsing. Mussolini's final days represented the complete reversal of his rise to power. He had seized power in 1922 through a combination of political skill and organized violence. By 1945, he had lost power completely and was being hunted as a war criminal. He had ruled Italy. By his final day, he was a prisoner of the very Italian people he had ruled. Clara Petacci's presence with Mussolini in his final hours is historically significant for what it reveals about their relationship and about Mussolini himself. In his final period, Petacci was not a necessary part of Mussolini's regime. She held no official position. She was not a military officer or government official. She was his mistress, his personal companion. Her presence in Mussolini's life was entirely personal, not political or professional. When Mussolini's regime was collapsing and he was attempting to flee, Petacci could have separated herself from him. She could have attempted to hide or to escape to Switzerland, which was neutral and relatively close to northern Italy. She had no legal or political obligation to remain with him. Her life would likely have been safer if she had abandoned him. Instead, Petacci chose to remain with Mussolini. She traveled with him during his final escape attempt. She was captured alongside him. She was executed alongside him. Her choice to remain loyal to Mussolini, even as his power evaporated and his fate became clear, is documented in multiple historical sources. This loyalty, and Petacci's fate as a result of it, adds a human dimension to the historical narrative of Mussolini's fall. It is not a redemptive narrative. Mussolini's concern for Petacci's safety in his final moments does not erase his regime's atrocities or his personal responsibility for fascism, but it does reveal that even a dictator was capable of personal feeling and personal loyalty. Petacci's story also raises questions about how history treats the companions and family members of historical figures. Mussolini is remembered as a dictator and is studied as a major historical figure. Petacci is remembered almost entirely in relation to Mussolini, as his mistress, not as a person with her own history and significance. Her execution alongside Mussolini meant that her entire historical legacy is tied to him. What happened to Mussolini's body after his execution is also significant to understanding the meaning of his death. The decision to transport his body to Milan and to hang it in a public square represented a deliberate choice by the resistance movement about how to treat the dictator's remains. Hanging the body in a public square was not a military procedure. It was a statement, a declaration that Mussolini would not receive the dignity of a proper burial. His body would not be honored or preserved. Instead, it would be displayed as a warning and as an object of public contempt. The crowds that gathered in Piazzale Loreto to view the suspended bodies included people who had suffered under fascism. They included relatives of people who had been imprisoned, tortured, or killed by fascist regimes. For these people, the sight of Mussolini's body suspended in the public square was a moment of justice, however crude. The public display lasted for hours. Photographs were taken. The scene became iconic. Images of Mussolini's suspended body would be circulated around the world as proof that fascism's leader had been defeated and destroyed. This public display contrasted sharply with Mussolini's earlier treatment of his enemies. During his years in power, Mussolini had suppressed opposition through secret police, and violent executions were often carried out secretly. Bodies were not displayed publicly. Mussolini had controlled information and prevented the public from witnessing state violence. Now, in death, Mussolini himself was subjected to public violence and public display. The circular nature of this, that the method of dealing with him in death opposed the methods he had used against his enemies in life, was perhaps not lost on observers. In the decades following the execution, historians and commentators have debated various aspects of Mussolini's final moments and the meaning of his death. Some have focused on the question of whether the execution was justified. The resistance movement's perspective was that Mussolini was a war criminal who deserved death for his role in fascism and in war. This perspective resonates with those who see the execution as appropriate accountability for a dictator who had caused immense suffering. Others have focused on questions about the legality and procedures surrounding the execution. Mussolini was not given a trial. He was not formally convicted of specific crimes. He was executed summarily by partisans without due process. From this perspective, the execution was an act of mob justice rather than legitimate accountability. A third perspective focuses on the practical military and political considerations. In the chaos of war's end, with Nazi Germany collapsing and military forces in disorder, formal legal procedures were impractical. The partisans made decisions based on the immediate situation. They had captured Mussolini. They considered him dangerous, and they executed him. Whether this was formally legal is almost beside the point. It was a practical decision in a chaotic moment. The most interesting debates involve the question of what Mussolini's final moments and death mean in a broader historical sense. What does it mean for a man who had wielded enormous power to be executed in a courtyard by partisans? What does it mean that he was concerned for his mistress's safety in his final moments? What does it mean that his body was publicly displayed? These questions go beyond the specific facts of the execution and speak to broader questions about power, mortality, and history. In the years following Mussolini's execution, the Italian nation had to confront its fascist past and attempt to move forward. The execution of Mussolini was one symbolic moment in a much longer process of national reckoning. Italy, unlike Germany, had ended the war by switching sides. Italian government had overthrown Mussolini in July 1943, and then signed an armistice with the Allies in September 1943. Italy had then declared war on Germany. This complicated history meant that Italy's post-war position was different from Germany's position of complete defeat and occupation. Still, Italy had to confront the reality of fascism. Fascism had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades. Many Italians had participated in or benefited from the fascist regime. Many Italian institutions had been shaped by fascism. The process of denazification that occurred in Germany had a parallel in Italy. The Though it was somewhat less comprehensive and less punitive, Mussolini's execution became a symbol of the end of fascism. The image of his suspended body in Piazzale Loreto became an iconic image, proof that fascism had been defeated and that its leader had paid the ultimate price. For the resistance movement, Mussolini's execution was an affirmation of their struggle. They had fought fascism for years, often at great cost. Many of their comrades had been killed or imprisoned. Mussolini's execution was a moment of victory and validation, evidence that their sacrifice and struggle had been meaningful. In international terms, Mussolini's execution stood in contrast to the fates of some other Nazi and fascist leaders. Adolf Hitler had died by his own hand in Berlin in May 1945. A few days after Mussolini's execution, other German and Italian leaders were captured and put on trial in formal international courts, such as the Nuremberg trials. Mussolini's summary execution by partisan forces represented a different form of justice, revolutionary justice rather than formal legal justice. It is important to acknowledge that many details about Mussolini's final hours are not perfectly documented. We do not have video recordings. We do not have objective, neutral observers. We have accounts from partisans who carried out the execution and from a few others who were present. We have documents written decades after the events by people trying to remember details that occurred in moments of high emotion and chaos. Historical documentation of the event is limited and sometimes contradictory. Different sources provide different versions of what Mussolini said in his final moments. Some accounts describe him as philosophical or calm, even expressing acceptance of his fate. Others describe him as fearful, attempting to negotiate or appeal to his captors. Some accounts describe extended conversations or speeches in which Mussolini attempted to explain himself or justify his actions. Others describe brief words before execution, simple statements or requests that were quickly concluded. One account describes Mussolini asking for water before the execution. Another account describes him asking for his glasses. These details may or may not be historical fact, they may have been added by those retelling the story, or they may reflect genuine last requests. In the chaos of a firing squad execution, such details are easily confused or misremembered. The accounts that do exist come primarily from the partisans themselves. These men were not professional historians. They were soldiers or resistance fighters who had been engaged in warfare. They were emotionally invested in the events. They had fought against fascism, lost comrades to fascist violence, and had now captured the man they blamed for decades of oppression. Their accounts, while valuable, are not neutral perspectives on historical events. Some partisan accounts emphasize Mussolini's dignity or composure in facing death, perhaps to suggest that the execution was a military action against a worthy opponent, or perhaps to enhance the narrative drama of the moment. Other accounts emphasize Mussolini's fear or desperation, perhaps to justify the execution as dealing with a desperate enemy, or perhaps to express satisfaction that the dictator was humbled in his final moments. The accounts vary on details large and small. Some describe Mussolini as speaking political statements even as he faced death. Other accounts suggest he was focused on practical concerns or personal relationships. Some describe him as facing the firing squad with arms crossed, a pose that might be interpreted as defiant or resigned depending on the observer's perspective. Other accounts describe him as more agitated or struggling against his captors. This uncertainty is itself historically significant and revealing. It reminds us that even events that we consider well documented and historically important are often known to us through fragmented and sometimes contradictory accounts. The truth of what happened in those final moments is partly lost to history, filtered through the memories and perspectives of those who witnessed it. When we read historical accounts of Mussolini's final words, we are not reading an objective transcript of what was said. We are reading interpretations, often written months or years after the fact, by people who were emotionally involved in the events, and who may have had reasons to present the events in particular ways. The historical record is not a video recording, but a collection of human memories, many of them fragmentary and some of them contradictory. What is certain is that Mussolini was executed. Clara Petacci was executed alongside him. Their bodies were transported to Milan and hung in a public square. The execution took place in the morning of April 28, 1945. These facts are not disputed by credible historians. The details surrounding their final words and exact demeanor are less certain and are subject to different interpretations based on the sources one consults and the assumptions one brings to reading those sources. Some historians who have studied the sources extensively have concluded that Mussolini likely maintained some degree of composure and dignity in facing death, consistent with his self-image as a strong leader. Other historians have concluded that the accounts of his dignity may be exaggerated, and that he may have shown more fear or desperation than the partisan accounts suggest. Still, others have concluded that we simply cannot know with certainty what his internal emotional state was. Only what the partisans claim to have observed. The absence of perfect documentation creates space for different interpretations. It allows historians to construct different narratives about what happened in that courtyard. It invites us to consider the nature of historical knowledge itself, what we can know with certainty, what we can reasonably infer, and what must remain forever uncertain because the primary witnesses are dead and their accounts are incomplete. Decades after his death, Mussolini remains a significant figure in historical memory and historical study. He is studied as an important fascist leader, as a figure whose rise to power and eventual fall shaped European history. His regime is examined as an example of how fascism functioned, how it appealed to populations, and how it was ultimately defeated. The manner of his death, summary execution by partisan forces, followed by public desecration of his body, has become part of his historical legacy. His death is contrasted with his rise to power and his years of authority. The man who commanded armies and bent the will of millions to his authority was, at the end of his life, subject to the will of partisan fighters. This arc, from power to powerlessness, from authority to execution, is a dramatic historical narrative. It illustrates the precariousness of political power, the temporary nature of even long-lasting regimes, and the vulnerability of even the most powerful rulers when their power evaporates. For students of history, and for those interested in World War II and fascism, Mussolini's final moments remain a significant and dramatic moment. A moment that symbolizes the end of an era and the defeat of fascism in Europe. On April 28, 1945, Benito Mussolini faced execution alongside Clara Petacci in a village courtyard in northern Italy. The details of their final moments are imperfectly documented and subject to different interpretations. What is certain is that Mussolini, who had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades, was executed by partisan forces in the chaotic final days of World War II. Mussolini's final words, whatever they were exactly, were not profound philosophical statements or dramatic declarations. They were the words of a man confronting death, perhaps concerned for those he cared about, perhaps focused on immediate circumstances, perhaps expressing fear or resignation or acceptance. Clara Petacci's decision to remain with Mussolini through his capture and execution reveals her loyalty and adds a human dimension to the historical narrative of fascism's end. Their joint execution and the public desecration of their bodies in Milan represented the complete reversal of Mussolini's rise to power and his years of authority. The execution of Mussolini was not a formal legal proceeding. It was an act of revolutionary justice by partisan forces who had fought against fascism. Whether this execution was legally justified or morally appropriate remains debated among historians and commentators. What is undeniable is that it occurred, and that it has significant meaning in the broader narrative of fascism's defeat and World War II's conclusion. The image of Mussolini's suspended body in a public square became iconic, a symbol of the end of an era, the defeat of fascism, and the consequences that can result from tyranny and aggression. For those who had suffered under fascism, the image provided a sense of justice and vindication. For others, it represented the chaos and violence of revolution and the cost of war. The final hours of Mussolini and Clara Petacci remain a dramatic and significant moment in 20th century history, a moment that continues to be studied, debated, and remembered as part of the broader narrative of World War II and the defeat of fascism in Europe. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.